Hey, it's Cameron Rich here. Welcome back to the Mixing in a Home Music Studio course. In this video, we're going to talk about compression. So firstly, if you're new to my channel and new to my videos and you like what you see, click the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be notified of all my future videos. So compression. This is definitely a topic about something that is used quite a lot in mixing. Some people say, oh, too much. And yeah, I wouldn't argue with that. You know, people love compression for some reason. They love applying it on everything and they think that it solves all the mixing issues in the world. Now, it is a great technique, don't get me wrong, but it is overused, and probably even overused by myself maybe. But let's go into the basics of compression anyway. So compression is basically a technique, a form, you know, we're using plugins, etc. to do that, to control the levels of instruments or vocals. In theory, what it's doing is it's just, we make some settings and we compress, right? So we will push down any peaks of the signal and we'll push up any of the quiet parts. So we're basically taking a waveform that might be very dynamic and it might be this wide, and we are compressing it to be more like this. And what that then does is it makes that part more rock solid, more audible, more stand out, right? That can be the case there. Now, technically, we don't actually really raise up the bottom, but what happens is in a compressor is you'll have a gain control or something like that. So really what we're doing is we're actually reducing the volume of the track. We're taking the peaks down, we make it quieter. But then what we do is we adjust the gain control and we push the whole volume up. So then it actually makes the quiet parts louder just by coincidence, or an adverse effect, right? Technically, because we're not really adjusting that, we're just actually bringing the volume up of the whole track, and because it's compressed, in theory, it brings it up. Now, when I say people can overuse it, you can compress too much, and you'll actually squash the sound of the track, make it have no dynamics whatsoever, no power, no impact, and even get distortion at times that you don't want. And it can be nasty distortion, it could be good distortion, right? Some people use compressors to create distortion deliberately. You know, sometimes we'll also use compressors, we'll compress heavily to do parallel processing. So we may add it back in with our raw original track to fatten it up and things like that. There's many techniques we can use with a compressor, and there's many styles of compressors. People love using vintage emulators and that sort of stuff that give you certain characteristics. There's different types of compressors, how fast the compressor will work and all that sort of stuff. So one concept of a compressor and how it works can be imagining somebody sitting there with their finger on the volume dial or on a fader. And this is what a compressor is sort of doing in a very easy, high-level concept that, you know, it's somebody sitting there with their finger on the fader, and every time the volume of the track increases really loud, so a peak comes in, they pull the fader down, quieten it. Then it gets quieter, they push it back up again. If it gets too quiet, they might push it up a little bit more. And then a peak comes in again, whoop, drop it down, right? And it's just, the software's doing that really, 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 really fast. And how fast it's doing is based on the settings you're using. Things like attack, right? So attack is how quickly will that compressor kick in when the audio goes above a threshold. Then you have release, which is how quickly will the compressor stop compressing when the audio goes back down below the threshold. And all these change the sound. Then you've got your ratio, which is how much compression you're going to do when the audio goes above it. And all of that sort of stuff, right? So again, this is a technique that's actually better explained with looking at the actual plugins, the settings, the controls in your software. So let's get into Cubase Pro and I'll give you a bit more of an explanation and some demonstrations.
So on the screen here, I have a compressor. The exact plugin itself is pretty much irrelevant. I'm just using this as an example. I tried to pick one that is very simple. There's a lot of variances with compressors, things that emulate hardware, things that are extremely complicated. But to keep the explanation simple, I wanted to go for the most basic one that I had here, with all of the controls quite visible to you. Now, at its most basic form, the best way to think of a compressor is basically an automated volume control. So imagine somebody sitting there with a fader, just like here on the screen, this one here, and they're sitting there with their finger on it, and as the audio is playing, they're basically pulling down that fader every time a peak or the audio signal gets loud. They bring it down, and then when it goes quiet again, they push the fader back up. So how these controls relate to how that function works is this. Basically, the threshold setting here determines when the person pulls the fader down. So when the audio source peaks above the value of the threshold, the volume is reduced. So imagine the person then brings the fader down. So that happens every time the audio signal goes above this setting. Now, how much they pull the fader down by every time they pull it down, whether it's a little bit or a lot, is based on the ratio. So the lower the number, the smaller the move they make. The higher the number, the bigger the move they make every time they pull that fader down. Now, how quickly they respond when the signal goes above this number, so that is determined by the attack. So imagine the signal's playing along and it suddenly peaks over it. I could be really fast at pulling that down, or I could be extremely slow at pulling it down, because maybe I'm just a little bit slower than everybody else. And that is the attack. So the lower the number of the attack, the faster I'm pulling it down. As soon as the audio signal goes above it, I pull it down really quickly. The bigger the number, the slower I am at pulling it down. So audio signal goes above it, I might wait a little bit, pull it down. So once the audio signal's gone above and I've responded and I've pulled it down, when the audio signal goes below the setting of the threshold, I should then bring the fader back up. And how quickly I bring that fader back up, or how slowly I bring that fader back up, is determined by the release. So the smaller the number, the quicker I am to quickly put that fader back to where it was as soon as this signal drops below the threshold. The bigger the number, the slower I am. So I might just go slowly, yes, that's it. Okay, they're the main settings of a compressor that we need to concentrate on for the basics. As I said, there's the makeup gain. That is an automatic makeup gain there, so in theory, that should be increasing the gain based on what we are compressing. If we don't have that on, because maybe we don't like it, we want to do it manually, as we start compressing something, it will naturally drop in volume because we're reducing the volume at the peaks. So we can compensate for that by bringing up this makeup gain. And what that does is obviously brings up the lower signals because they're not being compressed. So they naturally get turned up while the peaks get turned down. And you have some other settings here about peak and RMS. So we're not really going to go into that, but just quickly, peak would mean that it is responding to like peaks of the audio, literally the peak of the audio signals. RMS is more of an average. So as the audio source is playing, it's looking at it more at an average level and reducing or compressing based on the signal at an average. And hold sort of works in conjunction with release in the fact that even though you've got an attack that brings it down really fast, maybe you've got a release that brings it up really fast. But if you set a hold timer, what it does is when the signal returns back below the threshold, it'll wait for that hold timer before it then follows the release timer. So you can have a very quick release, but you can have a hold in there so that you guarantee that you are keeping the compressor running for a period of time after the signal returns below the threshold. So what impact does all of this have on signals? And it's going to depend on the audio source. Obviously the ratio is going to impact how much those peaks are affected. So it's in theory how much compression you're going to do, but it's not just by itself. The ratio and the threshold will work together to give you a massive amount of compression or a little bit of compression, and they work hand in hand in a way. You can have a low ratio, but you can pull the threshold down so far that it is compressing a lot of the time, most of the time. But when it is, it's still only compressing a little bit, but it's doing it a lot, so it's still compressing a lot. Otherwise, you can have the threshold set fairly high, so only the very peaks of the signal are being compressed, but when they are, they're being compressed really heavily. And that's just going to knock the top off all of the audio sources. Now, when you use something like a fast attack, what that's going to do is it's going to take the transient off something. So in the case of, say, something like a kick drum or a snare drum, if you do a really fast attack, you're going to take off that very first hit of the kick or the snare, which is the most prominent sound of it. So you're going to compress that. So if you feel that you've got something that's just too clicky or too transient, then you might want to have a short attack to just knock the top off those. If you want to retain that transient of the kick or the snare, or more work on the part after the transient of the kick or the snare, then you're going to want to slow that attack down so that the compressor doesn't kick in until after the transient has happened. So let's have a look at a kick, and I've got one here, and let's just see what we can quickly do with this. Okay. And now if we bring the compressor in, and we need to get the threshold to a level where it's going to compress, I've got the ratio down quite low, the attack is fast, release is medium. And you'll see on this meter here, it's showing what our gain reduction is. So that's quite a lot of gain reduction, 9 dB almost. And that's because I adjusted this threshold. So we might say that's a bit much. Let's bring the threshold up, clear that. Now we're getting 3 dB. But let's use some quite severe settings so that we can really hear what it's doing. So let's leave the threshold where it is, but let's increase the ratio. Now you hear there when I turn the compressor on, because I've got the attack quite low, you'll hear it takes a lot of the impact out of the kick. It really just dulls down that initial transient, that initial hit. So depending on what effect you're going for, you might actually like this because it might sort of round the kick out a bit, make it a bit more subtle, not as powerful. You hear there, if I slow the attack down, suddenly the transient comes back in and we get a fair bit of compression going on, but we're not losing the power of that very first hit. So what happens when we reduce the release really fast? What happens is, so our attack is quite late, so we're letting the transient through, and then we suddenly compress, but we also release very quickly. And because we've got the makeup gain going on there, what is happening is that's actually bringing up the volume of the trailing edge of the audio signal or of the kick. So what you sort of naturally get is you start to get more of the room coming up. So that reverb sound, or the life of the kick that follows after the transient. And if I make the release very slow, because the compressor is staying on for a long period of time, it's not only is it compressing a lot, but it's also hanging on to the compressor a lot on the end of the kick. So what it inherently sounds like is that it's almost like chopped off all of the room and made the kick drum extremely tight because it's compressed all of that last part of the signal as well. So you might decide that, for instance, this kick sounds all right, but it's a bit dull. We'd like to give it a bit more life, a bit more room. So you might sort of wind this back a little bit, leave your attack a bit slower so it's letting that through. Have a fairly quick release, fair bit of compression. So let's say that kick's a bit dull. Suddenly you got some more life there, a bit more room, a bit more live feeling to it. So let's have a quick look at, say, a bass guitar here, and let's do the same sort of thing. Let's give it a fair bit of compression ratio here. So with this setting here, we're pretty much taking away a lot of the life of the front hit of the bass. So with the fast release and some heavy, very heavy compression, I'm exaggerating all of these settings, by the way, we're getting a lot of the trailing edge of the bass. So if we find that we've got a song and the bass keeps disappearing in between notes, and we're not liking that feeling because it makes the song sound a bit thin, you might want to compress with this sort of setting here to get that bass to sort of carry on between the notes and just keep more level and not have that quick fade away. Or you might want to do the opposite. You might say, those notes ring out a bit too quick, too long, and I want to shorten it. So maybe we do a slower release. Or you might find that you've got a bass guitar and you're not happy with the transients that are happening at the start of the bass. Maybe they're too clicky. Maybe they jump out too much at you. You know, in the song, it's not quite level. It's not sitting right. You're getting these massive bursts of bass every time they hit or pluck the strings, and it's just a bit too much. So in that case, you're going to dial the attack down so that you grab those initial transients there And you might want to reduce the release so that it lets go pretty quickly as well. So suddenly the difference between the very start of the note and the end of the note is a lot less. So it's a lot more controlled and will probably sit in the mix a lot better, but it depends on the sound you're trying to go for in your song. And obviously this can be applied on anything, vocals, all of that sort of stuff. So the same concepts all apply. It's all about trying to level those instruments out. Now, you obviously don't want to over compress, so you want to find a nice balance between doing some compression and still having the signal or the audio source sounding natural.
So there you go, that is compression in Cubase Pro. Let me know what you think of it. Did it make sense? Did I explain it enough or good enough? Let me know in the comments. If you have any further questions or need anything further clarified, or I didn't explain something properly, let me know. I'd love to help as much as I can. And you know, as I've said previously, sometimes I'll forget to mention something, forget to cover something, or I don't explain something maybe good enough for you to understand. But I'm quite happy to go over parts and explain things further and maybe better if I can. So please do feel free to ask these questions, because not only will you get something out of it, but anybody else that reads the comments may benefit from those questions as well. So I do read all the comments, and I will answer as many of the questions and comments as I possibly can, as quickly as I can. If you did like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be notified of all my future videos. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.